G'day everybody and welcome to this week's episode. You are going to be listening to international expert on how to expand your business into Asia, Steve McGinnes. If you are thinking about international expansion now or at some point in the future, I can tell you are going to learn heaps from this episode. Steve's going to be talking about what people get wrong, what you should do differently. He's got a great summary at the end that sort of really wraps some of those things up that you need to be thinking about in the way that you engage in Asia differently in particular. He's also a marketer and has some really insightful comments about marginalised groups of customers and a bit of a challenge for you to see if your marketing is actually getting cut through to groups of customers that together might make up a lot more of the market that you think, even though in isolation they might seem a bit smaller. We've had some great other episodes on international expansion stories. Pete Cleary in episode 24, Annika Vandenbroek in episode 15. Please check them out if you are thinking about international expansion. This is a great opportunity for you. Before we kick off today, I have been receiving some questions from the community about whilst they love getting all this great information from guests on the Scale Ups podcast for their own business, whether I actually work with founders privately on looking at their business with a fresh set of eyes, developing a plan for scale and growth to improve their valuation and their options in the future, and then helping them execute that plan. And the answer is yes, I do that. I don't talk about it much on this show. In fact, I don't think I've done any plugs of the private work I do in 30 plus episodes, as I really wanted to keep this podcast focused on creating value for the audience. However, I'm being asked, and so I should probably share a little more. In short, I help founders build better valuations and exit options in the shortest possible time frame. That's what I do. I typically work with first-time founders of services businesses, often that have technology elements, some that don't. But in that, typically in that 1.5 or 2 mil to 20 mil revenue range, and who, as a result of never having built a bigger business than the one they've got right now, often feel isolated when they're making big decisions because they don't have, experienced and credible support team in their corner. They're often frustrated because they know they're wasting time and money by making big decisions without a solid sounding board to bounce things off. They're fearful that they're not going to get the potential, they're not going to fulfill the potential of their business because of their lack of knowledge. And they're worried that if they don't build it the right way, it's going to take them twice as long as it should, and they'll end up with limited exit options or a dodgy valuation, to be frank, if they ever want to sell the business. So I work with them to help them get clarity about their goals and confidence in a plan that's going to get them there and feeling comfortable with the advice and support structure they've got so they can feel comfortable making bigger decisions, excited about the improved valuation exit options that are possible for them as a result of the work that we do on the business, and a greater sense of enjoyment from their business and their journey along the way. And the way that I do that is I take clients through a proprietary methodology I've developed called FASTER, and it's FASTERR, so 2 R's on the end. And that is, first we start on the future. We understand their personal goals and their ambitions for the future. Then we analyze the business with a fresh and experienced set of eyes looking for key focus areas and opportunities. Then we develop a strategy, that's the S. We co-develop a 3-year plan to bridge the gap from where they are now to where they want to go. Then T is we've set a tempo. So we set up a monthly meeting rhythm to stay focused and create accountability for action and solve problems and adapt the strategy and execution in real time to make sure that we maintain momentums towards the goals. And then we evaluate the return on investment, of course, every 12 months in a more formal way to make sure that they're getting value from the process. And then the final 2 R's, one is for ramp up, the other one's for realized value. So every 6 to 12 months, we're looking at, does it make sense to ramp up the plan now using cash or external debt or equity because it's going well and we want to accelerate? Or do they want to realize some value for the founder by changing their role and stepping back and installing a different level of management, or selling some or all of the business, or just continuing to enjoy the journey? All of those are options. It's always about what the founder wants, and that's what I'm there to support them to do. I do this one-on-one or 1-to-2 with founders or co-founders as a growth mentor where we're just working together every month. And I'm also a fellow of the Peak Body for Advisory Board Professionals, so I can establish advisory or growth board functions where we also every quarter invite a couple of additional advisors into the room to help them solve strategic problems in more of a workshop style format. It's really fun. Every client I've worked with, I'm just so proud of them all. They're doing super well. They've all got revenues growing probably between 25 and 75% year on year. And I know 100% of them feel confident and excited about the future as a result of the work that we've been doing together. I do have a couple of spots, and I stress a couple of spots for additional founders I could support at the moment. So if you'd like to know more about how I can help you, you can just go straight to seansteele.com.au or direct message me on LinkedIn, and we can just tee up a brief chat. You're not going to hear me banging on about this episode after episode. But I just want to answer that question for the audience. So without further ado, expert on helping businesses expand into Asia, Steve McGinnes. Enjoy today's podcast.
Welcome to the Scale Ups podcast, where each week you get to hear Sean Steele, professional CEO, growth mentor, and advisory board chair, unpack the strategies that successful founders have used to achieve scale in their businesses. Stay tuned as he interviews the entrepreneurs who've made it, learns from industry experts, and follows a group of founders still striving to scale.
G'day everyone, and welcome to the Scale Ups podcast, where we help first-time founders learn the secrets of scaling so they can fulfill the potential of their businesses, make bigger decisions with greater confidence, and fundamentally maximize the impact they can have in the world. I'm your host, Sean Steele, and my guest today is Steve McGinnes. Welcome to the podcast, Steve. How are you today?
I'm absolutely fantastic, Sean. Thanks very much for having me. Great to see your smiling face this morning.
Mate, thrilled to see you. I'm thrilled to hear the birds in the background. I think they're they're perfect for our podcast today. For those who don't know your background, Steve, you've led multi-million-dollar businesses across multiple APAC locations, and therefore you've built a lot of deep knowledge in building business in Asia. You've authored Surfing the Asian Wave as a book that's really tried to capture some of those learnings and those insights. You're a frequent media expert and guest on BBC World News and keynotes and conference speaking. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. And we're going to talk, of course, about one obvious topic, which is, given your book, Surfing the Asian Wave, we're going to talk certainly about international expansion of companies in Western countries into Asia, and also the reverse. I think our chat offline was really insightful that, there's some pretty different approaches taken by East moving into West versus West moving into East. So I think it'd be great to unpack some of that. And, I was lucky enough to lead an expansion into the Philippines in my last company successfully. And it was, I think, for those founders who might be listening and are thinking about international expansion as a strategic option, you're really going to want to hear this conversation. And less obvious that we'll be talking about is perhaps some of your views on scaling. I think it'd be great to unpack a bit of that up front, but also I know you're a marketer at heart, and you've got some insights into what you consider sort of unique customer segments, maybe that are being ignored by a whole bunch of people. So if you're listening and you're thinking about, okay, well, maybe international expansion isn't my thing, but I am thinking about, where can I expand my business, maybe through some new customer types, today's your day. So why don't we start then, Steve, maybe with a bit of your background, if we can, on some of the key parts of your journey that, I guess, provided the backbone for the insights that you now have on how to maximize people's chances of succeeding in entering Asia.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so I think there's sort of a degree of universality in terms of people's fundamental desires and their needs, what they want from life. My background, I was a pub landlord. I used to run pubs in London. And I think I always said, if everything I know about running a P&L or running a marketing campaign, I learned running a pub in the East End of London.
Awesome.
And it's about understanding people and making them happy. And realization that nobody cares what you're interested in. Nobody cares what you want to talk about. Nobody cares what's important to you. It's about what's important to them. And I think that's as true standing behind a bar as it is running a multinational brand. We get so caught up in what we want to talk about. We get so caught up in what's important to us that we forget we're not our target. And I think that's true whether it's in Adelaide or Bangalore or Indonesia, or any market in the world. But then the nuancing around that is where the changes occur. And I think in terms, it's probably worth talking a little bit about the scaling bit at first, as you mentioned. So my career followed kind of the classic arc. Well, not quite classic. I went from being a nightclub bouncer to running a bar, to running a chain of bars, to moving to a big international catering company, running all their bars, to moving to AB InBev, working on Stella Artois and Budweiser. So I'm kind of an accidental marketeer. Who's what really I found very rewarding and very exciting about marketing was nobody threw any bottles at me, no matter how bad the day went. So we'd shuffle out of a pitch presentation going, "Oh, that went awful." Well, nobody physically assaulted me, and there was no vomit to clean up. So that was a good day, from being on the front lines. Yeah. So I did the sort of classic arc of moving up and running one agency, then running two agencies, and And at one point, I was running 5 or 6 different agency offices around the region, Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, Shanghai. And that really is where I guess I cut my chops in terms of understanding the differences in terms of the customer, in terms of what people wanted, in terms of those markets. And to put it, really broad senses in terms of Asia and the West, or the East and the West. And that's where I think the idea for just specializing in that. And when I wrote the book, which received a lot more attention than I was expecting, I was really writing the book that I wish somebody had given me when I got on the plane on the first time. It would have saved wasting a lot of money and a lot of mistakes. Fortunately, those mistakes were made with other people's money in my formative years. Yeah, and then just in terms of where that took me in terms of my own role, looking after those 5, 6 offices, multi-million-dollar P&Ls, to the point where I may as well have been working for a shoe company. So I was in advertising and design and branding, but when you get to that level, the P&L and the people decisions and the operational considerations, you could be doing anything. And my passion disappeared for it, and I was becoming increasingly concerned about what part of the plane I was sitting on, rather than what I was going to do when I got to the destination. So whilst I still, hadn't become wholly cynical about the industry I was in, I decided to sort of step out of a little bit. So I moved to a smaller regional agency, looking at a senior role there, felt the same way. To a bigger role in an even smaller agency, felt the same way. And where I've netted out as much by serendipity in terms of the way the world has changed, in terms of the interconnectedness, and no longer the need for the emphasis on the face-to-face and the more globalized nature of business now. I've managed to find myself in a situation where I'm very happy at the scale of me and some partners and some retainers and some projects, and feeling happy that I got off the roundabout while I still enjoyed it. And who knows, in 5 years, in 10 years, I might step back into one of those big roles again. But right now, I'm here in northern Chiang Mai, in Thailand. Spent a couple of weeks down on the islands. Probably pop down to the islands later this week. It's great for right now. And I think I completely see from the viewpoint of your listeners in terms of how do I get to 1 million? How do I get to 5 million? How do I get to 10 million? If 10 million is going to make you happy, 10 million won't make you more than 5 million. If it, as I say, if you're not happy with what you've got, why do you think having more is going to make you happier? So I think I would just add a caveat to that phrase, scaling up, to be whatever scale means to you. And for me, the scale right now is this. So if having gone through that growth arc and deciding where to be at, it's a great spot to be. But to go back to your point, I have got a couple of specialisms, which are now around the east-west convergence, or indeed divergence, depending how you look at it, and how to target those marginalized consumers that are being ignored for the more organized, vocal, smaller groups. And I guess that my caveat for everything now is, I think in 2022, there is very little need for a local generalist. When you can get any specialist or expert in the world to work with you at the click of a few keys, a do-it-all local is no longer much value.
Yeah.
Whereas being a global specialist, I think, is where the value is and where the interest is, and I guess where the passion is. You're passionate about what you do well, and you do well what you're passionate about, and you can't be passionate about everything. So
there's so much to pick up on there, Steve. The first thing that came to mind was I saw somebody put in front of me a 100-year strategy the other day, and I haven't seen anybody do anything more than the 3-year strategy the other day, it was fascinating because they'd looked at a whole bunch of kind of futurist predictions and so on. But one of the predictions, I think, to your exact point, was that I think it was that 80 or 70% or 80% of white collar workers will be working in a portfolio contract nature by the year 2050. And therefore everybody thinks they've got a permanent job and security is the thing, even though that's been significantly disrupted in the last couple of years. And there's a lot of people going, well, maybe that's not exactly how I want to run my life. But actually, the vast majority of the workforce could potentially shift to that kind of model where very few people are doing a standard full-time 9 to 5 anymore, and at least in white-collar professions. The other thing that really jumped out at me was the conversation around scaling up. I think is an excellent one, because the first conversation, as you know, I mentor private clients. I work with founders. Either I chair their advisory boards or I mentor founders and co-founders one-on-one. And often in the very first meeting, the question is, well, what's your ambition for this thing? What do you want it to become? And it's usually the conversation that has the most blank looks. Like, I'm not sure. Well, I just want it to get bigger. Yeah, but to what end? Is this a business that you're trying to build and sell on a timeline as fast as possible? We need to bring in external equity. We need to go super hard because you have a dollar figure in mind that you want to exit on? Or are you trying to build a lifestyle business that actually you'd be very happy if it never goes past a couple of $1 million and actually it's got high profitability and you're able to install someone? And why sell the golden goose if it's continuing to lay eggs, kind of thing? And I think there's a lot of ego tied up in the concept of an exit, and people saying, I was able to scale up and exit. It's like a big sort of badge of honor. But you think about what you're giving up. I had actually a client recently who received an offer from their business and they weren't planning on selling at all. So it created a really interesting conversation, and it's a reasonable offer. But that was their question was, well, do you still have energy for this thing? What do you want it to become? Are you happy with the way it is? Is there any reason to sell it? And what's the consequence of selling it? You're actually selling the next, 4 or 5 years worth of cash flow in addition to something that you actually really enjoy doing.
Yeah.
So what are you going to do instead?
And a big chunk of your identity. That's right. So if you've got something that you're just incredibly itchy to move on with, then I can see it can make a lot of sense. But there's so many ways to make the most of a business. But I think the thing that I always come back to is, what is the stuff that gives you energy and what's the stuff that takes it away? Because if what you're doing is not giving you energy, and many founders find themselves in that trap, it starts to get really difficult. They're having to do a lot of things they absolutely cannot stand doing, or the nature of the businesses becomes, somewhat to your point, maybe they've become too far away from the front line and they really miss the customers, or they miss the sort of hustle of figuring out problems on a daily basis. And just the nature of the role or the company has changed, and no longer is it giving them what they need. And I think there's something within that idea of the kind of people that are listening to this and the kind of people we interact with, on a day-to-day basis are a certain kind of person. There's a nice line. It says, not all action leads to happiness, but there can be no happiness without action. So doing nothing goes in one direction. Doing nothing ends up with depression and misery. But does that mean you need to be doing something 80 hours a week? And the question is, so I looked at a choice of, do I work 60, 70, 80 hours a week for the next 10 years and then have the ability to do nothing? Now, I'm not capable of doing nothing. The idea of, stopping, sitting on a beach and drinking cocktails. Okay, but what about the afternoon? What am I going to do then? So I would rather, the way I've looked at that balance is, well, I'd rather do 20, 25 hours a week indefinitely, or 40 hours when it suits me, or 10 hours when it suits me for the rest of my life, than lose the next 15 years, well, not necessarily lose, but put that up in order to trade off for 10, 15, 20 years of doing nothing at all. Because I know my nature, and I think a lot of the people that do that build, they don't necessarily understand their own fundamental nature. The idea that they think they can stop and do nothing and sit on a boat, whereas when they actually do that, they can't do it. And they end up moving back in again with it to do something again, not necessarily with the passion they had first time, because it's just not the kind of people they are. If you're a builder, you're a builder, and you're going to keep building. So I'm stretching out my building to the time, and again, that allows me the ability to work on the things I'm passionate about and do the areas that I feel an expert in. And I think one of the things I found out over the last few years is, the saying that the dumb people are full of confidence and the smart people are full of uncertainty. And you realize that the answer to most questions is, it depends. And if I ask somebody a question now on any topic and they give me a 100% certain answer, I realize they're not actually aware of the complexity of the topic we're discussing. So I would rather be a specialist in a few things that I can speak confidently on. And the nature of that global sort of location neutrality, and that shift from, oh, we can work anywhere, which means in the office, at your kitchen table, or in the coffee shop, to being we're able to work for anywhere. So you can work at home, in an office, in a coffee shop, on the beach, but more interestingly is you can work for Japan and India and the UK and Australia simultaneously. That then becomes a really interesting element. And then again, to take your point, that's where the people on either side of that equation, the people in London understanding the people in Bangalore, the people in Sydney understanding the people in Tokyo, beyond the ability to email, or beyond having maybe one or two people in your business that are the ones you send for those meetings, when suddenly everybody can be connected to their peers, when everybody can work either as an independent with another location, or whatever level your role is within a business, you're suddenly not only able to, but expected to talk to a partner, supplier, buyer, peer on the other side of the world. And I think that the few people that used to have those were aware by a series of hard knocks and experiences of 10 years to realize, okay, there's differences here. I need to approach these conversations differently. To suddenly being at the click of a button, talking to somebody on the other side of the world and not necessarily being aware of those cultural differences, those differences in values, differences in priorities. And I think the only place left in the world where you would only ever see 100-year business plan now is probably China, because they will.
Well, this was an Australian one actually, which was great and very visionary.
I think that that's built with the exception that multi-generational families seeing a longer-term plan, understanding that the plan may completely take a circular route to get to that end point. Whereas I think you're right, somebody having a 100-year plan for their business as an exception, but really seeing it, I guess, as a vision more than what we do next month, then the month after.
Not a tactical plan. That's right.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges I've seen over and over again is with East and West is this idea of time frame and prioritizing. When an Australian or US business goes into China and starts talking about their long-term plan, and they're talking 5 years, and the Chinese CEO is talking 3 generations down the line.
Whilst we're there, it's a perfect place to segue. So I think, one of the things I just take out of that last conversation that's super relevant for people is that your access to talent is people kind of know this, but I'm not sure that it's always leveraged in the way that it can be. To your point, the ability to hire people who are absolutely expert in a domain, in a different environment, to help you achieve your goals, regardless of where you are and regardless of where they are, has never been easier. And sometimes we can forget, even though we know that, and maybe we've done we've tried a few people on Upwork, or we've a similar kind of platform, Fiverr or something like that. But actually, there is a whole world of people now willing to and ready, and more people have transitioned into an environment where they're willing to work across borders. But I guess just sort of start to unpack. If we think about the big opportunity in this conversation, we've got a whole bunch of people listening. And we've listened to numerous founders in the last, say, 10 episodes. We had Mark Maley, who specifically chose not to expand internationally and was able to grow his company from 0 to 4,000 FTE and north of $500 million in revenue. And another founder in Melbourne, Pete Cleary, who grew his company to north of 200 by expanding into 14 countries, and international was a very deliberate part of their strategy. So everybody, if I think of all the strategic planning sessions I've had with founders or leaders, there's always some part of that meeting where that comes up as part of the conversation. Well, do we want to expand internationally? Why? And so on. So let's assume for this conversation that there are people listening who go, we really do. We see lots of real value in doing so. We want to expand into Asia, and we want to avoid some of the things that people constantly get wrong when they are trying to enter a Southeast Asian market, for example. Recognizing that, which I'm sure you'll talk to about the fact that there is no one Southeast Asian market and that every one of those countries is entirely different. But maybe you can talk to us a bit about what are the things that make people fail consistently when they're trying to expand into Asia.
I could sum it up in one sentence. It's the expectation that what worked here will work there. That is the single, and everything else is essentially nuanced from that. So it worked
Right.
in my market, it'll work in another market. And that, I think, is a stumbling block. And whether that's a case of our approach to the consumer will be the same, or our benefits we're conveying will be the same, or our price point should be the same, or our partnership should be the same. It's this work, we know what we're doing, we'll replicate it. And I think that is the fundamental. And I think the way of trebling your likelihood of success is the simple acknowledgement that things are different. If you go into it with the mindset of things are different, not better, not worse, they're different. People have different priorities, they want different things, they have different needs. How do I adapt what I have to them rather than expecting them to match my expectations? And that could be anything from a banking product, it could be a logistics service, it could be a HR service, it could be a chocolate bar. It doesn't matter. That would be the majority of the issue.
And so in circumstances where, okay, I as a founder, I've got my head around that, and I've heard enough scary stories of, Bunnings failing going into the UK, and there's so many big fails, right? Like big public fails of who've done exactly what you just said. Take the existing format, we'll just plonk it in that market. We're such a big hitter here. We're going to just succeed on day one when we go in there, and just completely fall over. Let's assume that we've gone in with the mindset of we're going to have to learn what actually works in this market, and we're going to have to adapt and change with that. How do they think? What are the practical steps that you think about to ensure that you actually get that right? How do you start to think about who do I need to get around me? How do I start to undertake that kind of research that's going to inform how we can do it successfully?
Okay, I think the answer isn't a
blindly.
$500,000 research project at all. The answer is a little bit of common sense. And I think there's 4 or 5 key areas that are going to be different. And once you understand what the difference is, I think then you create your strategy, whether that is hiring the right people, whether that is building a different offer, whether it's actually taking exactly what you've got right now and reframing the messaging. So I'll give you a couple of examples. And again, now I'll talk about East and West. And I know that one, Asia and the West, one's a geographic construct, the other's a cultural construct, but just for simplicity. Now, we can say things like Asia is more hierarchical than the West, which tends to be flatter. People will point out an incredibly flat-structured Japanese company and a very, very hierarchical German company. And of course, you're going to find exceptions. But my answer to that is usually there are some very tall Japanese people and there are some very short Dutch people. But we can say overall the Dutch are taller than the Japanese, even though I can find exceptions within that. So we can make broad statements that are mostly right and say in emerging markets, people tend to be more immediate benefit driven than longer term. So if you're launching a toothpaste brand, in Australia, it's no cavities, teeth retention, gum health. If you're launching that product in Indonesia, you want fresh breath, white teeth today. Because I want the immediate benefits, because I don't necessarily have the reassurance of long term. And if you're developing a financial product, you might be able to work with a level of complexity and technical jargon in the West, because people know these. You're building on pre-existing knowledge, whereas you may be going into a market that doesn't know anything about what you're talking about. We mentioned earlier the long-term and short-term, generational. You find a lot of markets here where if you want to bring in a new service, so banking in India, for instance, people in the West understand the benefits of having a bank account. You know why you want it. You know the pros and the cons. In India, it was very hard to get Indians to open bank accounts. They didn't understand the benefits to it because they'd never had one often. So it was sold in as a benefit for their children. You want your children to have a bank account, even if you don't want one yourself, because people often can care more about the success and happiness of their kids than themselves. So it's about taking your product, your offer, and understanding that how you're approaching it might not be the same way as everybody else. I did a project in China for one of the big electronics retailers on their electric razors for men. Couldn't sell them. turned out the closest shave wasn't a big. If you're some big hairy-assed Australian, the closest shave is great. If you're some Chinese guy that's not particularly, astute, closest isn't the easy thing. But they wanted the fastest. Shanghai business people, super busy. What's the fastest product you can give me? And then also we found out that every single image you've ever seen for an electric razor is the same shot. Good-looking guy in the morning having a shave, beautiful woman in the background. Every single time. You talk to guys in China, they go, yeah, I shave at night. Suddenly, we didn't need to change the product. The closest shave razor was also the fastest one. All we needed to do was change the message and change the imagery. So it might not be about fundamentally changing what your service or product is. It's about understanding what is it about your product or service that's appealing to that market. And as you say, there is no Asia market. There's 110 million people in the Philippines. There's 240 million people in Indonesia. I live in Thailand, and it always baffles people when I say to them, Thailand is exactly the same population as the UK, 66 million. But if somebody says, oh, we're going to adapt our product for Thailand, no, really? Well, would you adapt it for the UK? Well, of course. So it's not necessarily about there being anything wrong with the product or service you've developed, because clearly people want it. But what is it about it that people want? How do I nuance it for the market I'm moving into? How do I make perhaps merely some communication changes to make it relatable, understandable, and engaging in that market? And then it's the action of, do I need to hire some people to be on the ground? Is this a market that I can run from a different location? Do I need to change my offer, my communication? I think going into it with the functional question of who do I need to hire? What do I need to change? What do I need to do? Is one step too far. The first question needs to be, what do the people in my market I'm moving into want? And it may be that question is out of the 15, 20 markets in ASEAN that have got a population of more than 50 million people, which of them already have a consumer that wants a lot of the same things that my current customer does? And then maybe it's about finding the market that best suits your product rather than finding the biggest market and then trying to adjust your product for it. But it's that understanding. But again, it's starting it with well, I don't know. Let me do some finding out first. And I think that is that's the major hurdle. And it almost seems that the bigger the business, the more likely it is to be, well, this worked, therefore it'll work. If it doesn't work first time, I interviewed a guy for the book who had led, it was 3 different businesses, each spending, I think it was $10 to $15 million on their launch, and each had failed. But each time they tried the same strategy over and over again, which was, let's throw money at it. And that's not a solution. It's barely even a tactic. But that base understanding of what is it that I have and what is it that people want, I think that is our starting point.
And what do you think, Steve, what do you think drives that decision making in larger companies where they've got this assumption that what we did already worked and we just need to go? And do you think it's just the pressure of, usually very deadline driven, very financially driven, usually given very tight timelines, and therefore maybe the research that they kind of go, I don't really have time to do all that research, so it just sort of goes by the wayside and they just rush because they feel like they need to hit a number and
it's because it worked. So if something works, it's much easier to give advice to somebody that things are going badly for. If everything's going well, it must be because of the things you're doing. Therefore, those things will work somewhere else. So I think the success is what makes people feel bulletproof. And it may be the success was in spite of what they were doing. It may be that they were in a market where the rising tide, took all the ships up. Or it may be that what they developed was absolutely perfect for that marketplace. So I think the success blinds people to the need to change. Whereas if things are going badly, it's clear things need to change. And I think that's the challenge. And again, the successful business the most successful person in that business is the senior decision maker. So not only has the business done well by those decisions, but that decision maker has done well by their own decisions thus far. So I think that becomes a sort of a double-edged sword in terms of the individual and the business feeling that whatever they're doing is working.
I interviewed Sidney Finkelstein recently, who's written this. He's written 25 books, I believe, and one of them was about this called Super Bosses. And one of the things that he said was the biggest mistake that leaders make is exactly what you said, is overvaluing their own personal experience, because what it was relevant for was the problems they were faced with in the past. And if you're facing a problem that requires new thinking, well, to be frank, your experience is probably not worth a lot. And actually the worst thing you could do is to overvalue it and transpose it onto this new issue, which is exactly what we're talking about here, right?
And that segs nicely into the other topic we talked about around the marginalized consumers. So I think, taking your brand or product and moving into a new market with it, absolutely. I mean, there's a huge opportunity within that, but there's also untapped consumers within the markets people are already in. And by marginalized, I'm not necessarily talking about, cultural or gender, which I think gets a lot of attention. Rightly so, it gets a lot of attention. And I have friends I know who do a lot of work around trans rights and those people who are marginalized within society. But purely in terms of the numbers, though, I mean, so I work with some of the big FMCGs, the very big FMCGs around this, and their attention has been going on small, gimmicky developments, often on the surface, to target very vocal marginalized groups. But then when you look at just the Australian market, so 13 million Australians have some kind of chronic visual impairment. That could be blindness, it could be glaucoma, retinitis, which means they're going to find it very hard to interact with any form of sort of brand or product communication. 10% of the population is colorblind. Yet all the products and brands, whether it's a brochure, whether it's a website, whether it's a range of packaging, uses color as its navigation tools. Sadly, 12% of the Australian population, and it's about the same in the UK, is functionally illiterate. And you have around 20% of the Australian population that don't speak English as their first language. So their language at home isn't English. So when you combine the people living to a degree of perhaps poverty, people living with visual impairment, people for whom English is a struggle, when you add all those people together, they're actually more than the mainstream. So the marginalized people in our society add up to more than what we would consider to be the normal mainstream people. Yet businesses and brands are kind of ignoring those customers with things that could be quite simply fixed. And again, it's not necessarily about fundamentally changing your offer or your product or your brand. Often it's about adjusting around the edges. So what are we doing with our communication material in terms of how we speak, in terms of what we say, what we write, the language we use? When you have, like I say, you add up the illiteracy and you add up the non-English speakers, you have 30% of the Australian population that are going to have trouble with written English. Yet we write our communication material, we write our brochures, we write our websites with this level of complexity and jargon and highfalutin language, as my dad used to call it. Whereas in fact, simple, clear. So there's a thing called the Fleischer-Kincaid test, which will evaluate the level at which something is written. So the average in the UK can read and write at the age of a 6th grader. So that's about an 11-year-old. The average reading age is 11, which you might think is awful, but Stephen King writes at the level of a 6th grader. Dan Brown writes at the level of a 7th grader. Ernest Hemingway wrote at the level for a 10-year-old. And you can't say that these writers aren't communicating complex, nuanced, engaging material, but they're doing it in a way that everybody can understand. So making things complex doesn't necessarily make them better. So just in terms of looking at the means in which things are communicated, the benefits that are being portrayed, the use of imagery and iconography can very simply make what you're selling or what you're developing or what you're putting out into the market much more engaging to, as I say, the marginalized groups that when you add them up are larger than the non-marginalized groups, which I think is always interesting. And again, similarly, sorry, after you.
And are you seeing any examples of people doing this well at the moment that you can think of, where you go, actually, someone's really nailing this?
Well, I think there's a level of intuitiveness to things, to brands like Apple and Netflix, and where you can engage through the whole ecosystem, almost in a culturally, language neutral manner. So you're engaging with those brands in a way that doesn't require any pre-knowledge. That doesn't require, but it is something that's building quite a lot of momentum. So it's hard to point at somebody right now that's doing it, but there's a lot of movement going on underneath the surface. So when you're working with somebody like Unilever or Coca-Cola or Nestle or P&G, who are the people that I'm talking to about it right now, it's very hard for them to make even the slightest change of their the great tanker that is their business. It's easier for them to send out this is our LGBTQ pack that we're going to do for Gay Pride Month. This is our blind pack that has Braille and an integrated, QR code that we're going to do for a limited edition of 1 month. It's easier for them to shoot off these little one-offs than it is to change the direction. And I think that's the benefit where the smaller companies, the 1, 5, 10 million, they can build this in. And I think they can build it in a way that just produces a better experience for their day-to-day customer, but actually is a step change in terms of engagement for the marginalized customers. So we're working on things now where your average consumer looks at it and goes, oh, that's easier to read and it looks great. But somebody that was previously unable to engage with it, it's, wow, this brand is taking the time and the effort to engage with me. I'm rewarding that brand with loyalty and my spending power. And it's really a win-win. Who doesn't want an easier to understand and engage with product or brand or service? We all do. So I think that, and again, I think that's one of the issues where people have looked at this idea of universality and inclusivity and seen it as something for other people. I don't need it, so it's not for me. Whereas in fact, who doesn't want it?
Yeah. It's some corporate strategy that sits over there. There's a committee that deals with that.
And this belief that it's something you throw money at. Whereas what we've seen is there is a huge ROI in it for quite a small early on investment, particularly if you build it into new product development or new materials. There isn't really any additional cost, but the ROI is there. It's the right thing to do commercially, and I guess it's also the right thing to do in human terms, in terms of just doing the right thing, win-win.
Yeah.
So and I don't see these really as being opposites from how to engage marginalized consumers at home and how to engage new consumers or customers abroad. It's really the same fundamental of what is it that these people I'm talking to want and need, rather than what is it that I want them to want and I need to say, I think would be the...
That's really nice. It's a really nice tie back, and it makes complete sense. It's right back to basics, isn't it? Sorry, right back to 101, where there's so much of what we can do in larger businesses when we've got more people and everyone's got ideas, and you can get more and more complicated and further removed from who's actually talking to the customer and when was the last time we had a real conversation about what they want and what they care about and what they're going through and so on. And I see that regularly, particularly as businesses, if they're getting larger, quite often that connectivity to the customer disappears and it hasn't been embedded in the organization, where actually there's constant dialogue and constant feedback and iteration as a result. So I think those things can be really easily overlooked, and all of a sudden your product stops selling or things just start plateauing. You're wondering why, but no one's actually talking to the customers and no one knows what's going on with them. Is there something that you mentioned when we talked offline that the companies, if we put them back in quotation marks, companies from the East expanding into the West sometimes take a bit of a different approach to what the West might naturally do coming to the East. What did you notice about that we might need to learn from?
Well, I think that one of the key aspects of that is we know all the companies that have moved from the West into the East, and we heard the fanfares and we saw the press conferences, and we know about when an Australian company moves into China. We know about it when a British company has a big win in India, because that is our style. We're results oriented, we're action driven. We want to see the CEO with the big check. That's what we get. When it's moving the other way, often we are unaware of it because it is done very differently. Most people, driving a car in Australia or the UK don't necessarily know that car is owned by a Chinese company that built it, that own the company that built it in their home market. So I think there's a quiet, discrete global expansion going on from Asia into the West that's actually much larger than the more showy, glitzy expansions moving the other way. And I think that also belies the fundamental differences between the two cultures of look what I've done today versus look what I'm building for the future. And I think there's also a preconception that these kind of things we're talking around with the cultural nuances only matter when you get boots on the ground in the market. What I say to people, and again, this ties back to this idea of being the global specialists, is if you're talking to somebody on a Skype or a team meeting that is in India, essentially you're in India. You need to conduct yourself and talk and engage and be cognizant of the value system of the people you are talking to, even if you're not physically there. You no longer become part of a foreign team when you step on the ground. We need to be aware of this every time we're opening up these conversations. And I think to go back to your point earlier, that I didn't get a chance to mention because I got spun off onto something else. I think people do have experiences around engaging around the world, but they tend to be quite transitional, functionally led engagements. I need somebody to deliver this one thing, and then I get it back. But I think there's the depth of relationships, the length of relationships, the amount of value add that you can deliver is equal. I mean, I've had through the COVID period engagements with clients. I've worked with an amazing, wonderful bunch of guys and girls in an agency in the UK for 18 months before we met face to face. And I think I've done some of my best work with those guys, having never met them. And the depth and value and the strength of that relationship, whilst it is virtual. And I think that's the other element. So I think taking that into account of any engagement we're having cross-culturally, we need to take the same care and consideration and pre-thought and preparation as if we were stepping into their office, as if we were stepping actually into their boardroom in that market, rather than just clicking a button.
That's very true. Yeah. And you absolutely make that preparation very differently, naturally. You're going to get on a plane. Like I think about the first time I went to the Philippines and Malaysia and Indonesia and so on, looking for, building partnerships, looking at buying businesses. And in each of those countries entry, if I hadn't had experience there, I was researching like crazy. I was making relationships with people on the ground who would help me to make sure that I don't sort of stuff up. But why all of a sudden, if I jump on a Zoom call, should I abandon all of that work?
But the good news is most people do abandon all that. So if you're one of the people that doesn't, you have a huge advantage. If you still take the time to find out, who's on that call, what their background is, what their role is, who their friends are, who do you have in common, what small talk can you make, what should you be wearing, all the things you would have done as a matter of course to step into that physical room. Most people aren't doing that. So, and I don't know about you, but I'm not really interested in most people. So if most people aren't doing it, it's a great advantage for the people that are. So I think that's one of the fundamental ways that we can still, whilst everybody can talk to everybody everywhere in the world, most people won't bother taking the time. Most people won't go into it with an open mindset about what they don't know. Most people won't do the prep. So for those of us that do, we've got a huge advantage on everybody else. And again, whether that's home or abroad, wherever you're going into it, we're not the smartest people in the room very often. And particularly when you can access any room in the world at the click of a button, the chance of knowing more than everybody else is pretty slim.
Yeah. Pretty low. I've got one last question for you. So this has been a fascinating conversation. And for me, as we've been talking, I've been thinking through all the experiences I've had and all the learnings that I got going internationally and setting up joint ventures and so on. And there was lots of mistakes made and lots of things that worked really well. And a lot of the learnings that you're talking about are really kind of coming home to roost in the ones that we did exceptionally well around the preparation, around the customization of our approach, the understanding of the local environment and the local styles and cultures and values. I'm wondering though, in the last couple of years, if we go back to generalizations that we were talking about at the front, going, okay, there's lots of nuance to the generalizations clearly, but in circumstances where doing business in the East has always been known to be, significantly important to have a very strong relationship, and often forged in bars after the pitch during the day and all that kind of stuff, where COVID's made that incredibly difficult. What have you noticed that's changed in the way business is being done? If it's a new relationship, during COVID that somebody's trying to set up in an Asian market that they haven't been able to get to and maybe still can't get to, how has that changed? Or has it changed?
So it has changed, but I come from the generation where we believed that the best relationships were built in the bar. Or long boozy lunches, and that is how you built that trust and that connection. And that may have been true for a while. It may not have been. It may just be what we all wanted to believe to be true because we liked boozy lunches and hanging around in the bar. I'm not sure that really any big deals were actually done that often in those environments. I certainly haven't found taking myself out of the 2 a.m. at the karaoke bar circuit has done my business any harm. Hasn't done any harm whatsoever. I think the importance of relationship building cannot be overstated in Asia. I think there's a lot to be said that in Asia you build the relationship and then get the project. Whereas in the West, often now you get the project, and over the course of that project, you build the relationship. It is still the other way around. But that relationship building doesn't need to be done in that classic, drunk in the bar with the CEO fashion. And I've done my fair share of drunk in the bar with the Chinese CEOs. I'm just not sure it really ever delivered anything beyond what I could have achieved by, as we said earlier, taking my time, understanding them, making a connection, reaching out, understanding that, and I don't think going and getting drunk with them was ever a shortcut, to building those relationships. It was part of, but I'm not even convinced even now that it was a necessary part of. And I think, as you say now, people are realizing that actually I quite like spending time with my family. I quite like being home. I didn't necessarily enjoy being out, 5 nights a week. But that doesn't mean the relationship building isn't vital. It just means we know to go about it in a different way. And that is around opening up lines of dialogue with individuals outside of those big meetings. It's around taking the time to find out about people so you can mention and reference what you know about them. It's about finding the commonalities. It's about finding mutual contacts and mutual points of trust, where you have had somebody in your network that shares their network, and leveraging that and the personal connections. So I think how we go about it is different to previous. I think the shortcut of the social events may no longer be possible and may no longer be appropriate with a completely different generation of decision makers, albeit with the caveat that was it ever really necessary, or was it just a two-way habit that everybody got into? So I think that to take your point, absolutely vital.
I love that.
But vital but executed in a different way in 2022 and beyond. Yeah.
And those are great. That was a really nice summary also of I guess some of those key points and how we can go about that differently. Well, Steve, thank you so much for your time and sharing your wisdom with us, folks. If you've been listening to the show and you've been thinking about international expansion, I'm sure you have learned something today, and whether that's in relation to international expansion or whether it's in relation to maybe some markets that you're not really paying attention to, and a chance to sort of do some reflection about the way that your marketing and your messaging is positioned, and how well that's going to be getting cut through to some of our more marginalised groups. Steve, how can people follow along with what you're doing or get in touch?
SteveMcGinnes.com is probably the best bet. My name and .com at the end of it. I've also drop into LinkedIn quite often. I'm not a tweeter as yet. SteveMcGinnes.com, and my direct phone number is on that. Again, in the spirit of direct communication, my hand phone number's there. I'd much rather have a beautiful conversation with people.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Steve. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed the show today. Thank you so much to you, Steve McGinnes. Folks, a couple of things before you go. If you enjoyed today and you think other people might want to hear this, take a screenshot, send it to a friend, jump on the podcast, leave a review on Apple. I know that Spotify now is accepting reviews for podcasts as well, so you can jump on there if that's your favorite platform. You can join us at ScaleUps Podcast on any of your favorite socials except Twitter. Just like Steve, haven't quite got there yet. It's not quite my thing. But just remember, in the context of scaling, whatever that success looks like to you, the only thing that can guarantee that you won't ever scale, whether you're expanding internationally, going after a new market, or just trying to create a lifestyle business, is that it's going to get hard sometimes, and you've got to remain unshakable in your faith that you're going to achieve that goal and remain flexible in your approach. You've been listening to the ScaleUps Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Steele. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much, Steve. G'day everyone, just a couple of quick things before you go. If you have questions that you'd love myself or an upcoming guest to tackle about challenges that you're facing in scaling your business, please just jump straight on the website, scaleupspodcast.com. You can record your message straight from your mobile by hitting the button on the right-hand side of the page, or you can just email them the old-fashioned way, questions@scaleupspodcast.com. And just a quick reminder, nothing we spoke about today constitutes financial or business advice. If you are considering making big decisions in your business, seek out a professional who can look at your situation in detail and make sure you're getting sound, personalised advice. Thanks for listening. Look forward to being back in your podcast feed next week.